All right, good morning, everyone. It is time for us to get started. We are in Exodus chapter 15. It seems like when you, well, at least for me, when I miss a day at church or a day of Bible study or something like that, it seems like I've been gone forever. Then I kind of forget what's going on in the world. But we're back. I wasn't feeling good the last few days. So I'll probably be looking at my notes more than I normally do, just for the simple fact that when I was preparing for this class, I wasn't feeling good and took a time off and then got back to it. And I'm thinking, what did I write? I have no idea. So I had to go back and kind of reread all my notes and figure out what I was doing, what direction I was going in. We're in Exodus chapter 15. Now, next Sunday is the last of our quarter, and we're going to be having a new teacher come March 1st. Justin's going to be stepping in, and there's a survey in the back he'd like for you all to look at and fill it out. And he's going to be teaching, and I don't remember what the topic was, even though I did read it. You'll have to go on Lightpost and look at that. But in the book of Exodus, there's 24 chapters remaining, and I want to get it, and I want to finish it. So I want to cover 24 chapters in 2 Sundays. So my goal today is to cover chapters 15 through 27, which we're not going to, by the way, and then cover 27 through 40 next Sunday, which we probably won't do that either. But that's my goal, but I know I won't do it. Anyhow, it is what it is. There's so much stuff in these chapters. Man, it would take a long study, and we're about to go into some stuff, and I'm hoping we can make at least a chapter, I think it's 23, but there's so much stuff there that I would love to spend more time on, but we're not going to. But anyhow, we'll move on. Okay, so looking at verses 20 through 21 of chapter 15, this always is in my mind, and if you've been in the class long enough, you know how sometimes my mind works, is that verses 1 through 21 is the song the people sang to the Lord. Now, I always wondered when I read stuff like this, the children of Israel sang this song to the Lord, or they spoke it. So I'm wondering, there's like 2.2 million people. Is this a song that they already knew, or did they make it up as they went along? And how long did it take them to actually know this song for them to sing in unison? These questions that just rang through my head. Irregardless, doesn't matter. And so they come to this area, this body of water, and it is bitter. They cannot drink it, and they complain to Moses. Can I get a reader for verses 22 through 26, please? All right, you got that, T? Yes. Would you mind reading it, please? Wait for the microphone.
Then Moses led Israel on from the Red Sea, and they went out to the wilderness of Shur. Excuse me. They journeyed for 3 days in the wilderness without finding water. They came to Marah, but they could not drink the water at Marah because it was bitter. That is why it was named Marah. The people grumbled to Moses, "What are we going to drink?" So he cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. When he threw it into the water became drinkable. The Lord made a statute, an ordinance for them at Marah, and he tested them there. He said, "If you will carefully obey the Lord your God, do what is right in his sight, pay attention to his commands, and keep all his statutes, I will not inflict any illnesses on you that I inflicted on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you."
Thank you. I wanted that reading to be read because I want to focus on verse 25. one thing we have seen, and we're going to continue seeing this throughout the study, is how the Israelites will come to a situation and they'll complain to Moses. They always complain to Moses. But in verse 25, it's very interesting. They were tested in that they were asked to accept and obey God's law. If you look at that, the King James uses the word proven. The NIV uses the word test them. So prior to that, about the same time, God is going to heal this water, and he's going to show them that, once again, he is the creator of heaven and earth. But in order to get the full blessings of God, they need to be obedient. So this idea of testing here, St. Augustine, he wrote this. He said, trials come to prove us and improve us. This quote identifies the two purposes that trials accomplish. One, trials improve us. In other words, it matures us. And two, trials develop our faith and helps us to be ready for the next trial. If you think about an athlete, and I don't know how many of y'all are athletes or working or work out or whatever, there is positive stress and negative stress. And working out and physical exercise is positive stress on your body. But unloading a semi is negative stress on your body. When you think about chopping wood, a negative stress of picking up all that wood, right? So there's positive stress and negative stress. So it also is the same with our faith. Without going into a deep study of 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 through 7, and James chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, in those texts, both of them talk about testing one's faith and the trials that purify us, like one would purify gold. Comparing these three ideas together, we can see how God allows trials and tribulations in our life, and he seeks to show us where we need to improve in our relationship with him. Thomas Kempis said, adversaries do not make a man frail. They show what sort of man he is. When trials test us, our faith is at stake. When we pass the test, we prove the genuineness of our faith. But who are we proving the genuineness to? To ourselves or to God? I'll let you answer that yourself. Trials reveal the condition of our faith. This section is is showing the people of Israel where they are in their faith with Jehovah. Now, they've already seen all these miracles. They've seen the plagues. They've seen the parting of the Red Sea, and Egyptian dying, and all this stuff, but still, they don't have the faith that they need to be truly obedient to God. They had lived in Egypt for 430 years with these false gods. They are now being asked to believe in one God and to submit to him only and no other. But many of them have problems with that. And we all pretty familiar with the book of Exodus and how so many times the children would continue to be disobedient and fall back in their own ways and so on and so forth. And God, in these next few chapters, Jehovah is going to get the people ready for this covenant that is about to be presented to them. So go ahead and look at verse 26. And he said, if you diligently heed the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his sight, give ear to his commandments and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases on you, which I have brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you. This goes for us today. If we are faithful and we are diligently seeking his voice, then none of the things that come upon, the salvation that is being offered to us in the kingdom of heaven is going to be ours. We are not going to be sent into Hades, where the sinners are going to spend eternity. Now let's get and turn to Deuteronomy chapter 8, and I'm going to have, if I can get a reader for that one. Deuteronomy chapter 8, very interesting passage because he kind of elaborates a little bit more on this. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verses 1 through 16. If I can get a reader for that. All right, go ahead.
Deuteronomy 8, 1 through 16.
1 through 6, please.
1 through 6. The whole commandment that I command you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you. So you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and by fearing him.
Very powerful text here, and I wanted to bring that out because it talks about your clothes didn't wear out, you didn't wear out. I mean, how God was blessing these people for 40 years. Wouldn't it be nice to have a 40-year pause on your body decaying? That would be awesome, wouldn't it? 40 years. Imagine not buying clothes for 40 years. Man, that'd be awesome. But God blessed the people. So the benefits of being faithful to God is amazing. All right, now obviously today we're not going to have that, but you get my point. What are your comments before we move on to chapter 16? Now remember, Mike.
My wife accuses me of having clothes that are 40 years old.
Yeah, I think I have some clothes that are probably 15 years old, yeah.
They'll come back in style.
They'll come back in style, that's right. All right, chapter 6. Oh, yes, sir.
I guess the thing I'm thinking about is this is a time of discipline for them too. You've got the people, they are going to die off, the ones that were there that didn't enter and do what God had asked them to do to go in. So God is blessing them and protecting them, but he's also disciplining them at this time. So it's a difficult time. He says they hungered. We know that many of them would die in the desert and so forth. So it's a time that God took care of them, but it's also a time of discipline.
And that's a great point. And hopefully we don't go down this path too far. I firmly believe that if the current generation, meaning those who were 40 and older, would have been faithful, they would have seen the promised land and got there sooner. They wouldn't have died off. That's just my opinion. Because he waited a whole generation, 40 years, for the stubborn people to die. And then he brought a new generation in. Now, I'm a firm believer. All right, just be ready. I'm a firm believer when it comes to a congregation growing and maturing. It is easier to give birth than it is to resurrect the dead. And when you're looking at the people here, these people were so set in their ways over and over and over, no matter what miracle they were seeing and witness, they were not going to fully obey and accept what Jehovah had told them to do. So instead of trying to resurrect the dead, gave birth to a whole new nation and brought them into the promised land. That's just my opinion. Okay, let's move on to chapter 16 before you have any more comments. All right. Chapter 16. So we have the people coming in and they're complaining there's no food. And we talked about verse 3 last week. There's no food. And in verse 3 they said, but we had pots of food. We had so much food. It was so amazing in Egypt. Why did we leave? Numbers chapter 11 verses 31 through 33 talks about the manna from heaven. We talked about this briefly last week. One thing I do want to point out is in verse 21. And so they gathered every morning, and every family gathered up their food every morning, and they prepared their food every morning. And when it came time for the Sabbath, they gathered the appropriate amount. Now, we do find out later on that some people didn't quite follow all the instructions, and so the manna spoiled, and there was worms and all that, kind of going back to my point. Here's an example of Jehovah making sure his people's needs are taken care of. Remember in Matthew chapter 6, verse 26, Jesus is sitting there talking. He says, "Look at the birds of the air, for they neither sow nor reap, nor gather into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not more valuable than they?" And we need to remember this. You know, so many times, I don't know about here in America, but especially in other countries, that they literally live meal to meal. I mean, and then there's people that their whole day is spent in just getting a meal together. And so I've been doing some intermittent fasting. At first, it was, psychological. It's very, very psychological. And I was thinking, oh, I'm going to die if I don't eat my breakfast. Well, 24 hours now, it's like, okay, it's no big deal. But have we ever really faced starvation? I mean, really? No. Even when the army forgot to feed me, I still wasn't starving. I wasn't going to die. But my point is this, is that every morning the people got up, they went out there, they gathered the food, they made it, they prepared it. Trusting in Him does not mean a person just sits back and does absolutely nothing. God provides food for His people, and it is our responsibility to collect it, prepare it, and then eat it. This isn't just, someone just sitting around and say, okay, God bless me. Bring it to me. It doesn't work that way. We also see in this concept of taking care of the poor and the widows and the travelers in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 22. I was going to read it, but I'll just going to tell you what it says. It basically says that when you harvest your field, round the corners. Do not harvest the corners. Leave the corners for the sojourners, for the widows, for the poor and all that, so they can come and glean it. But the whole idea, and that was kind of the food stamp program for the Jews at that time, was they were supposed to go out there and harvest the corners of the fields and then bring them back and prepare their meals. Okay? There was no meals on donkeys back then, There was just, you go get it. If you're hungry, go get it. So God will provide for the people. All right, that brings us to chapter 17. All right, we're moving along, I'm telling you. All right, chapter 17. All right, the people cry for water again. Here they are. So the congregation of the children, chapter 17, verse 1, set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sinai according to the commandments of the Lord. So they get there, and the people contend with Moses. Verse 2, give us water to drink. So Moses then cries out to the Lord, and again. So verse 7. So the children called the name of the place Messiah, and because of the conditions of the children of Israel, because they tempted the Lord, saying, "Is the Lord among us?" I want to focus on this idea right here. So the Israelites are at this body of water, or not body of water, they're here, they're thirsty, they want to drink. God tells them what to do, and they question, is the Lord among us or not? Again, and I'm going to go back and hit this point over and over and over again, is that how many miracles do you all need to show that who this person that you just called Lord, which the Hebrew word is Yahweh, you acknowledge that He is the one that is in existence and He had created everything. You acknowledge who He is, but yet you still question and say, is He with us? All the miracles that Jehovah did, each one of them met a need that the people had. Each time a need arose, a miracle. He took care of them. He took care of them. But yet, that miracle or that act failed to produce a habit of faith in the people. The idea that faith is a habit, I want you to think about that because faith is a habit. It's something you do. It has to be a part of you. It's not something you just put on and take off whenever it's convenient for. It's who you are. It's like breathing. Faith is who you are. Now in verse 8, we have the children of Israel facing a man-made problem now, because now in verse 8, there's going to be this nation, the Amalek. They're going to come and they're going to fight against Israel. Now, in preparing for this, I didn't really find anything that really substantiate the idea that even the 660,000 men that walked out of Egypt were actually trained fighters. And I've always wondered about that. Now, some of them may have been guards, whatever, but I don't know if they were trained fighters. But this Amalek, this is a great-grandson of Esau, according to one commentator. Someone turn to Deuteronomy chapter 25, and I'm going to have you read verses 17 through 19, I mean. So as the people, don't read it yet, but I'm going to have you read it here in a minute. So it is not sure if the Israelites were actually trained fighters. And we're not sure why the Amaleks were going to fight against Israel. It could have been that they felt threatened. Maybe their livelihood was being threatened. We're not sure. Whatever the reason, God is not happy with them, and he says that I'm going to blot them out of existence. So in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 through 19. You have that, Mike?
Deuteronomy 25, 17 through 19.
Yes, sir.
Remember what Amalek did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he attacked you on the way when you were faint and weary, and cut off your tail, those who were lagging behind you, and he did not fear God. Therefore, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies around you, in the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance to possess, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget.
I bring that up because I want to paint a picture of the strategy of the attack that happened. So if you look at there, around verse 17, it talks about how he attacked the weak and the frail in the back half of the formation, okay? So the strong and all that, they're up front, they're moving, and Justin's not in here. Anyone else been in the Army or Marines, did road marches? Okay, well, I've done a lot of road marches, and sometimes there's an accordion effect right here, right? So if you get 2 million people, man, you're just spread out, okay? And probably spread out for a couple of miles. So Amalek, he attacked the rear of the formation. That's probably where most of your animals are, probably your food supply is. You're weak, you're vulnerable, and that's where he's attacking. And military strategies have been passed down from generation to generation. It is interesting because going into Israel's history, if you study some of the geographical locations of some of the battles, you could see how the Israelites used the terrain to their advantage to beat their opponents. Now, one of the most famous strategists was a general by the name of Sun Tzu, a 5th century Chinese military leader who wrote the book called The Art of War. This document is taught to commanders around the world. It is one of the premier documentation of how to fight a war. And there's 13 chapters. And it talks about every valuable teaching a young commander needs or a military needs to be successful on the battlefield. Talk about training, defeating your enemy, and all kinds of things. Here are a few ideas that came from the art of war. If your opponent is of choleric temper, am I pronouncing that right? Choleric temper. In other words, he's hot-tempered. Seek to irritate them. Pretend to be weak that he may grow arrogant. If his forces are united, separate them. Attack him where he is unprepared. Appear where you are not expected. And so these things in war is very psychological, strategic, and one thing that when the Britons were being attacked by the Vikings would draw the Brits into like a path to like a little ravine. And the Vikings were actually in the creeks and the lakes. And so as the Briton was sitting there attacking, they felt pretty confident because they were dominating the small force that they were attacking. Well, as they're advancing forward, then the Vikings would then come around to the sides and flank them, right? And now you're only fighting 75, 80 people. Now all of a sudden you've got 50-50 on both sides of you. And the British lost a lot until they kind of figured out how to beat that. So here, I bring this up because you have 2.2 million people, 600,000 men of fighting age. Your formation is covering several miles, and the rear of the formation is being attacked. And so what are you going to do? And if we were to read this, we see that God comes up with a strategy, and he tells them that Moses is going to raise his hands with the staff, and when his hands are up, you're going to win. When his hands go down, you're going to lose. So all Moses had to do was this. Everyone else had to go out and fight. All right? This is the only miracle. Back down. And so, again, just because God has something for us, that doesn't mean we just sit back and do absolutely nothing. Even when the miracle is being performed, what was the end result? To have faith. And so the Israelites then were to go and to fight this battle, and to have faith in God that he is going to deliver them. Go ahead and turn to James chapter 2. James chapter 2, verse 14. The faith that the people had in God and the efforts they put into the battle, resulted in the victory of the Lord. And in James chapter 2, verses 14 through 17, who has that? Someone could read that for me?
What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled," without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead.
Thank you. Verse 9 is the first time we come across Joshua, and he later on is going to be Moses' apprentice. What are your comments before we go to chapter 18?
You wonder why God made the miracle, or had the miracle of Moses raising his arms. But over and over again, we've seen that the people of Israel have turned against their leader and turned against Moses. In the chapter earlier, he was talking about how the people had turned against Moses and Aaron because of the things they didn't have. But here, God's showing that they don't support their leader, then they're going to lose the battle. And it's kind of a unusual way to do it, but you got men having to hold his arms up to keep this battle to win.
That was a good point, and I appreciate that. One thing I forgot to mention is that this battle took a while. It was not a 30-minute battle. Now, Herschel, how old are you? 82. You're 82. So Moses is about 80, 81 right now, right? Yeah. How long do you think you could hold your arms up like this? Not very long. So they put rocks and pillars underneath Moses' arm to keep him up. And so this battle took a while. But that's a good point. You know, and I appreciate that. Are we winning? Are we winning? Oh, his hands are up. Okay, keep going. I don't know. All right, chapter 18. Here in this chapter is a really neat chapter. Man, I wish we could slow down a little bit, but this, in my opinion, Exodus probably needs a good half a year to really go through and study it. Moses is reunited with his son and his wife, and his father-in-law comes up, and he talks to him. Look at verses 18 through 23. We're not going to read that, but I want you to just be looking at that. All right. So Moses is reunited with his family. He talks with his father-in-law, and his father-in-law notices how Moses is like governing 2 million people. And he says, Moses, you're going to wear yourself out. This is what you need to do. You need to break it down and put men, respectable men, in positions and kind of break it down. He breaks it down for him. And I think this is really brilliant of Jethro here. Look at verse 23. He says, if you do this thing and God so commands you, then you will be able to endure, and all this people will also go to their places in peace. You see what he just did? He gives them this brilliant plan to break down the formation of the people. You know, if you think about You think about the military. Now, we got two people who served in the Air Force. I don't know who else has served in the military. But then you have the president. You have the ranking officers there in the Pentagon. And then they have, and it goes all the way down to your company commander. Okay? Same concept. Think about a big business. Big businesses, right? UPS. You know, you have the CEOs, and it just comes all the way down to the people out here in Lufkin. And it just breaks it down. And brilliant plan. But what I want to focus on is verse 23, is that he says, if it is God, if God approves this, then do it. And I get the impression that God did approve it. I believe that Jethro came for this very purpose, to give Moses this plan, because he's going to wear himself out. And I think about Jesus in Luke chapter 19, verses 11 through 26, when he talks about the men with talents. He talks about, this person was given 10 talents and so forth and so on, and it was based off of their abilities. So there was a qualification that these men had to have had in the story of Luke. Now, look at the qualifications of verse 21. So Jethro says to Moses, he says, okay, here's the qualification. You shall select from all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, and hating covetousness, and place each of them to be rulers of thousands. And he breaks it down. So that's the qualification right there, those three qualifications. Fear God, men of truth, and hating covetousness. Now, each one of these qualifications can be seen in the upcoming 10 Commandments that are in chapter 20. The first qualification, fear God, would cover the commandments of the first and second commandment. Love the Lord your God and have no God or graven image before me. The second qualification, men of truth, do not take the Lord's name in vain and keep the Sabbath holy. That's 3 and 4. I didn't put loving your father and your mother in that one. I wasn't quite sure, so put that one where you want it. The third qualification is hating covetousness. You shall not murder, commit adultery, steal, bear false witness, or don't covet your neighbor. And that's the remaining of the 10 Commandments. So those three qualifications we can see in the 10 Commandments. We may not see what God is doing. And I'm sure the Israelites had no clue what was going on in the qualifications. They may or may not have made this connection. I don't know. This is just Paul making a connection here. But it is not for us to necessarily make the connection at the time, but it is for us to be obedient at the time and just to do what we are told to do. And we're going to see this here in a little bit. Moses is going to have to do just what he's been told to do. It's funny, my son Andrew and I were sitting there talking about this last night. Yesterday was his birthday. And he had spent some time with a neighbor while I was truck driving at the time, so he stayed some time with the Ockers. And Mandy was a very dominating woman, all right? And Andrew was a very... I don't know what he was, but he was wearing a hoodie, and Mandy's like, Andrew, go get a coat. He goes, I got a hoodie. No, I said, go get a coat. I don't need a coat. Go get a coat. It's not that cold out. Go get a coat. No, I am not getting a coat. I'm going to go from your car to the school building. Let's just go to school. And very back and forth. Very controlling, very dominating, and it was kind of funny. And I said, well, you know, sometimes, Andrew, you just need to do what you're told to do and quit arguing about it. And that is true, because the phrase, because I said so, is one that I've never used with my kids. I never used that. Now, him and I both agreed that I think a good phrase is like, I don't have time to explain to you now, just do what I told you to do, and we'll talk about it later. And that's one thing we both agreed. It was her way or the highway. And he was like, okay, well, I guess I'm leaving, you know. But the Israelites, or Moses here, we're going to read this in a little bit of what he did. But back to us, and back to the idea here that the Ten Commandments are going to be something that the Israelites just need to obey. Now that brings us to chapter 19. So Jehovah comes down to this mountain, comes down from the mountain. All right. Now we see here in verse 1 of chapter 19 that it's been 3 months after the children had gone out of the land of Egypt. So they're in the wilderness, they're at the mountain of Sinai, and God's going to come down, he's going to talk to the people. And he gives them all these instructions, or he gives Moses all these instructions. And Moses, he calls up the elders, and he calls everyone, he says, okay, here's the information. Okay? And then they're to go and tell the people. In verses 3 through 15, he is preparing the people for the coming of the Lord coming down. They are to wash their clothes. They are to consecrate themselves. The tribe of Levi is supposed to also purify themselves. And so the whole nation is getting ready for this purification. And 3 days from the time they are told, God is going to come down to the mountain. Now, verses 3 through 6 is a message. And notice verse 5. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. He is letting the people know, I am setting you apart. I have chosen you out of everyone else, and this is what I want you to do. As long as you obey my covenant and my word, then you will be my special people. Same goes for us today, does it not? Are we not God's chosen people, been baptized and been redeemed by the blood of the Lamb? But we have to remain faithful as well. So the children are now, or will be, the holy nation of God. They will be a special treasure in his eye. Now, how did the congregation respond? In verse 8, they respond with amen, or really what they say is, and all the people said, the Lord has spoken, we will do. Again, did they practice this at one time? Did they all know this? Did they all know what to say at the one time? The point is they all agreed. They all agreed to it. All in favor, raise your hand. We all said aye. So they all agreed to it. They all agreed to obey God's commandments. They all agreed. Now verses 23 through 25, God tells Moses a second time to get the people ready and to remind them not to come near to the mountain, because if they were going to die. There were boundaries set, and Jehovah said, "Do not cross these boundaries. Any animal, any person, they're going to be struck and dead. They're being killed." And so he says to Moses again, "Moses, go up to the people and tell them a second time." And Moses, he's kind of puzzled. Look at verse 21. And the Lord said to Moses, "Go down and warn the people, lest they break through to gaze at the Lord, and many of them perish. Also, let the priests who come near the Lord consecrate themselves, lest the Lord break out against them." But Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, 'Set boundaries around the mountain and consecrate it.'" That sounds like Andrew, doesn't it? And this is what God said. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Away, get down, and then come up." In other words, do what you're told, and then come back to me. All right, I don't have time, Moses. And I thought about this. Basically, Moses just needs to do what he's told to do. And we're the same way, are we not? We're the same way. We know what the Scripture teaches. We know what it says. Love your brother. Pray for your brother. Have mercy on your brother. Blah, 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 blah. And what do? Well, did you hear what so-and-so did, man? He's not my brother in Christ. Man, the things that we do. And God's just saying, you just need to do it. You just need to love your brother. Now, so I thought about that, and I thought, well, this kind of goes back to the commander's intent. Remember I talked about that? I want to break it down a little bit further. In an operation order, there's 5 parts to the operation order. There's a situation. The situation here is that Jehovah's coming down, and he's going to speak to us. The mission is that the people need to get themselves ready, and they need to prepare themselves for the Lord. Third, the execution. How is this going to take place? Well, there's going to be boundaries set across, and the tribe of Levi is going to be there too. So when we come up, this is how we're going to do this. The fourth one is a support. The Levites are going to support this. They're going to be backing up Moses, and they're going to be providing additional education if needed. And then fifth, the commander's intent. What is Jehovah's intent? Is to make sure that the nation sees Jehovah, and that his servant Moses is the one that you need to follow and listen to, and then respect him. Now, again, this is Paul's way of looking at this, but Jehovah wanted the people to be sure they understood what needed to be done. Because as we have seen already in the past, and they're already taking manna and trying to save it for 2 or 3 days, because they don't want to go out the next morning and collect the manna because it's too early. He knew that if they were not told a second time, you'd get 1 or 2 individuals getting a little closer, and then they'd be struck dead. And chapter 20 now brings us to the 10 Commandments. And we're not going to read the 10 Commandments. We're going to make a few comments here about verses 18 through 21. Because 18 through 21 starts with God giving instruction to the congregation, and they're watching in fear. And God wants this. He wants them to watch in fear because he tells them that in verse 18 that they tremble and stood afar off. And so he wants to inflict this fear on them because he's going to test them, and he wants them to respect him out of love and concern. Now, the remain from verse 19 all the way to chapter 23, verse 19, is a section that God gives these instructions to Moses and to the nation of Israel that is a prelude to the covenant that he is going to make with them, and also the commandment. And this is a section that I wish we could really dive into and look into a lot more. It talks about how to treat slaves, how to treat sojourners, how to treat your brother. I mean, just so many different things on morality, on some special circumstances of everyday life things that they might struggle with. It covers that. But before we move on, I want to look at verse 20 of chapter 25. So in chapter 20, verse 25, they're talking about making an altar. And this altar that they are to make is not supposed to be fancy at all. It's just supposed to be some stacks of stone that they can sacrifice an animal on. And they're not to hew any graven images out of this, out of it. This is a structure that is temporary. They're not to make it elaborate or anything like that, because the emphasis is not on the altar, but on the sacrifice and worshiping God. I thought about the Lord's Supper here too, when we prepare our hearts and our minds for it, how the emphasis should be on the emblems and the sacrifice. And I think a lot of men try to get our minds thinking about the worship and why we are here. And that's what Jehovah is trying to do with this, is in verse 25, he says, don't make anything fancy. Don't use any tools on it. Just make it functional. And then in verse 26, he talks about not having steps. Don't make it high. A lot of the pagan religions in their temples, their altars were high, and the priests walked up into it. And one commentator said that one reason why the altars were so high is so that their gods could hear them better. And I thought that was funny. And so, remember, they were wearing robes back then, okay? So to see your priest walking, or one of your elders walking up the stair with his robe, he says in verse 26, there'd be no stairs that their nakedness may not be exposed. And so God understood, people, and so the altar was supposed to be on the ground at level and nothing spectacular. Later on, the altar will also be, when they actually build the Temple of Solomon, will also be one that is not, it's fancy, it's made out of gold, I think. I had to go back, I had to read that, didn't read all that. But anyhow, that was the second bell, and we got to chapter 23, actually. We're going to pick up in chapter 23. If you get a chance, read those two chapters, 21 through 23. And it talks about some of the laws and the things that they have. Thank you so much. That was a quick journey through all those chapters. Thank you for your thoughts.